Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to the Library Tour of Doom. A library tour conducted by Lord Ganesha and myself, consisting of every book that I have ever had in my library. All the ones that I have on the shelves now, all the ones that I have in my book inventory notebook. I'll hold up little images of their covers, and also all of my ebooks. So it's going to take a while. And today we're going back to 2015 to a work of history that reviewers at the time were quick to call that favorite word magisterial, and that really does repay that kind of praise. It is a major work of prose. This is by Robert Service, and it is the end of the Cold War, 1985 to 1991, when it all ended. And as you can tell from the cover, amanuensis notwithstanding, the book has four main characters. There are all sorts of other characters in here. Of course, George H.W. Bush, Margaret Thatcher. There are a whole bunch of other figures, but there are four main figures in this story. There's Ronald Reagan, who went from a fairly typical lowbrow Republican war hawk to someone who not only wanted arms control, but arms reduction. Came actively to dream about a world in which there were no nuclear weapons, in which there was no possibility of nuclear war. So he is a main character, and so is his Soviet counterpart, Mikhail Gorbachev, who doesn't get the credit that he deserves, I believe, in 20th century histories for the unbelievable, almost unprecedented in human history, steps that he took to change the course of his country. You can argue all day long about why he took those steps, but it took an enormous amount of political courage to do. Reagan was fairly standard in his approach to the evil empire, to the Soviet Union. He believed that, it turns out correctly, that the Soviet Union was on its last legs in terms of economy, and that if the United States just kept up the economic pressure, just outspend them at a war game they can no longer afford, that eventually they'll either belly up or they'll collapse. I don't think anybody. There's a point that's made over and over again in the course of this book. It's a terrific book, absolutely terrific. Service is just incredible, and there's a point that's made over and over again in this book, and that was also made in a particular song right here, right now. Those of you who are a certain vintage will remember the song I'm talking about. The feeling that we were all living through history in a way that none of us had anticipated. In the 1980s, in the early 1980s, in the late 1970s, when I was writing angry editorials, op-ed pieces, there wasn't, I don't think, a single person anywhere in the world who thought they would live to see the end of the Cold War, and especially the end of the Soviet Union. I don't think there was anyone who thought that was going to happen. And then suddenly it did. Very suddenly, it felt like. In fact, there's a great book on the subject of exactly how the Berlin Wall was breached and why it was. Of course, naturally, since it has the most Soviet possible origin story, because it was a bureaucratic miscommunication that caused. But one way or another, there was the feel of permanence. We had been living with this for our whole lives. This gnawing anxiety that there's these two completely irreconcilable empires were at daggers drawn, and the daggers were thermonuclear weapons. So we lived every day thinking that today is the last day. Now it is going to happen. Now the message is going to come through that the Soviets have launched an attack on Anchorage or something, and that will cause a response, and that will get a response, and it'll all be over, except for a nuclear wasteland. Gorbachev clearly, on one level, hated that idea as much as Reagan did, and took steps to change his country in a way that I don't think I know of an example of a national leader who took similar kinds of steps. But the four main characters are him and Reagan, and his foreign secretary, Eduard Shevardnadze, who we had quite a bit to say about in the op-ed writing days, and most of all, George Shultz. So Shevardnadze and Shultz, and most of all, Reagan's Secretary of State, George Shultz, who comes across in this book. This is not a small book, but boy, oh boy, is it definitive. Just definitive. he comes across in this book, as he does in virtually every book in which he even makes a side appearance, as a sort of dominating figure. Soft-spoken, omniscient, very much the real-life version of a George Smiley figure, for instance. And all the more amazing for the personality mesh between him and Reagan, because it wasn't always a perfect mesh. And the reason why I'm concentrating on these personalities instead of on the big sweeping geopolitical issues is because Service is really good on both. This is the book to have on the subject. Maybe not on the whole of the Cold War, but certainly on certainly on the part that seemed the most dicey, that seemed the most powerless. Those of us who were wondering what was going on, what can this Gorbachev guy's motives possibly be? We knew perfectly well at the time that we were raising suspicions like that, and we'd long since been raising suspicions about Reagan, just in terms of, his mental competence. Even when we were raising those concerns about Gorbachev, we knew perfectly well the hardline gallery of KGB spooks that were all around him, and maybe were going to kill him, and that would certainly be worse than him if they had his access to his country's nuclear stockpiles. And we didn't get that. We had to wait a long time. We had to wait 40 years. And one of those KGB spooks, one of those ruthless geopolitical manipulators, is now in charge of Russia anyway, the rump of the Soviet Union, and wants, clearly, a return to the good old days. Wow. I don't see them that way, but one way or another, I can revisit them in this book. Right? I read this and reviewed it when it first came out, and I have been itching to reread it. I keep going back, not so much to the geopolitical stuff, although I shouldn't give that short shrift. It's well done in this book, but I keep going back to the personality profiles in here, and I've been itching to get back to them. So this is a book from my history bookcase, but you never know where the library tour of doom is going to go, and this one is definitely a recommend, especially if you lived through it. If you lived through that period where suddenly there was no Soviet Union anymore. Suddenly, almost overnight, it felt like it disappeared. That had never happened in any of our lives. Maybe minor satellite countries here or there had changed a dictatorship, or maybe changed a name or a piece of ruling nomenclature or whatever. But for an entire world power to just disappear, that was amazing. This book brings back the amazement of those days and the tension of those days. You always have to keep in mind when you're reading history that none of the participants know they're in a work of history. They don't know the future. But anyway, that's your book for today. Who knows what we'll encounter tomorrow? We'll find out together. Thank you, BookTube.